The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. And Trump getting himself into another huge media storm and row in America as he denounces members of the violent gang MS-13 as animals. And we'll talk about that this evening. I will also tell you about my visit to Windsor today, looking at the preparations for the royal wedding on Saturday and give you some sense of the atmosphere down there. But first, and I think at last, we have a serious police report written by Simon Chesterman, who is the national lead for armed policing, where he is saying, because of the elevated terror threat in this country, and bear in mind, the head of MI5 said the other day that 12 terror attacks have been stopped in this country over the course of the last year, and what Simon Chesterman is saying, that maybe we now need to understand that simply having 6,000 armed police officers in this country simply isn't enough, and it's about time we started arming police officers. He was particularly talking about rural areas where, of course, response times from, the armed response unit from the local city could be 20, 30 minutes, or perhaps in some cases even more. But it is a big general debate, and would you feel safer if your local policeman was carrying a gun? Well, I tell you what, I certainly would. I've argued for this before. I think we have to start arming our police officers to deal with the new threat we have in this country. If you agree with me, call 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think, no, the more people carry guns, if the police carry guns, then the burglars are more likely to carry guns. Maybe the police being armed routinely just elevates this whole thing and will lead to more guns being used and more people being hurt. And certainly some people do believe that. And if that's your view, then please text me on 84850. Or maybe you think, actually, do you know what? What Farage wants to do is turn us into America, where everyone's carrying guns the whole time, and that's not the British way. If that's how you feel, then please tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, watch us on Facebook from the London LBC studios, and you can comment there too. Honey in Wiltshire, and she's living in a rural area, of course, says to me already by SMS, I would feel safer if all police carried guns and used them. Well, honey, the point about using them is they only use them in extremis, but they've got them there. Now, the one part of the UK where the police do pretty much routinely carry guns is Northern Ireland. That, of course, because of a different history. But I've always found it fascinating that no senior politician would contemplate, making this argument for a wider carrying with the police of guns. And many police chiefs have fought shy of this, which is why I welcome what Simon Chesterman, the national lead for armed policing, is saying. Would you feel safer if your local bobby was carrying a gun? Do you know what? I certainly would. Tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong, but I think we've reached that point. Robin is calling from Whitehaven in Cumbria. Good evening, Robin.
Hello, Nigel.
So, there you are, Robin. You're living out on the coast. I don't know where your nearest armed response unit is at Whitehaven, but I would guess that it's some considerable distance away.
I think it is a bit away. Now, I don't like to go into too much detail, but we have had problems up this neck of the woods before with armed police having to be called out. But aside from that, Nigel, is community policing is more important than armed police, because why wait till the problems escalate to the point where they need armed police? Invest in more community policing, and that's where you stop crime escalating, and you can also stop it before it actually becomes a crime.
Robin, how would you define community policing?
I would say what used to happen in times gone by, where each estate would have a local policeman or woman, and then they would be interacting with the children. So local knowledge.
So you mean back to bobbies on the beat and being part of the community again?
Exactly. Theresa May was warned by the Police Federation what would happen if she kept cutting to police numbers. Now, the police numbers have dropped, even in a rural area where we are. Very rarely you now see police. So armed police is a last response when you're dealing with problems when they've gone too far. Society needs to get back. Bobby's on the beat, as you called it.
Yep.
important, very important, because they've done more than just police work. Bobbies on the beat. They were part of the community.
Yes.
I can remember when you were a child, the local policeman would come and play cricket with you while he was on duty. And looking back now, you see things and you think, well, he wasn't actually just playing cricket. He was actually involving kids to, stay on the right tracks.
And building trust, and because of trust, he might pick up more information on bad things that were going on. Robin, I'm not going to actually take issue with you or disagree with you. I do personally believe that we do need more community policing. Certainly, the one thing that police do tell you, always off the record, is that the levels of paperwork and bureaucracy they're tied up in make it very difficult. I'm told, Robin, that in the metropolitan area, here in Greater London, that at any one time, only 4% of police are actually on the streets. And I find that figure absolutely, totally astonishing. So I'm with you about community policing, but, Robin, even with good community policing, you may not be able to stop some of the terrorist outrages that we've seen all across Europe over the last few years. And I put it to you, living in a relatively isolated part of Cumbria, I put it to you, Robin, that you would be safer if there were some police in Cumbria that were properly trained and were carrying handguns.
If it's the ultimate threat to life, you're possibly right. But the problem is, a lot of these people, they get radicalised. Terrorists, we're talking terrorists and things like that.
Yeah.
They get radicalised. And community policing is by far a better option because in the long run it's cheaper. It's cheaper, and it has an effect on so many.
Robin, as I say, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think we need both. But look, I thank you for your point and your call. Ivan says, I live in Northern Ireland. All our police are armed. Seems very strange to me that yours aren't, considering your crime rates are far higher. Ivan, I'm with you. I completely understand what you're saying. Stephanie feels differently on Facebook. She says, no, we don't need armed police. We need a bigger police presence. That's kind of back to what Robin was saying. Bring back the beat bobbies. I'd feel safer with more police officers. And stop and searches are not seen to be racist. That's kind of moving us on a bit, Stephanie, but I do also rather agree with that. Cleve is calling from Bedford. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, should we arm more police officers? Simple as.
I think it's important for you to know that I was a firearms officer in the police, and I fundamentally support that position. And the reason I say that is, how can a police officer protect the public, which is what they're there to do, if they can't actually protect themselves adequately? And the point is, our officers are highly trained, highly specialist, and it is a continuum of force. So if they meet an offender, obviously there's an escalation of threat, and they will have other things available to them, such as a baton and gas. And of course, the ultimate is the drawing of a firearm. But for me, your focus is on terrorism. I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
But actually, the distances that some officers have to travel as a consequence of an armed response, in the rural areas particularly, those officers are in a high area of vulnerability whilst they're waiting for their armed colleagues to arrive. And of course, I go back to that point. The ability to defend yourself as well as the public must be a priority.
Cleve, I understand that point, and my previous call was from Whitehaven, a relatively remote part of Cumbria. But just think, Cleve, about London Bridge, right in the middle of the city of London. When those three terrorists, drove that van over London Bridge, they then got out of it, and if you remember, headed down towards Borough Market. They were confronted by an on-duty police officer who incredibly bravely, drew his baton, drew his truncheon, or modern-day equivalent of a truncheon, to take them on. He got stabbed in the eye. He got stabbed elsewhere. He was on the floor. They moved on. He was lucky to live. My argument, Cleve, is if that guy had been carrying a handgun, he'd have finished the three of them off and saved lives.
Well, I mean, we never know if that was going to occur, but the reason why police carry sidearms is they're actually a backup weapon for their primary weapon. It does have some tactical advantage where they're in close quarters and they would elect to use the sidearm. But you're absolutely right. The action-reaction time for an officer is very limited. The reactionary gap if someone's coming at you with a knife.
Yeah.
They have the advantage. But at least if the officer can draw a handgun, they can take that fatal shot if if and only if it's the ultimate last thing that they need to do. And that the officer that you quote was seriously injured.
Yeah.
He may have had a different outcome. He may have been able to protect himself better, but at the moment, the unarmed officer does not have that array of capability in their possession.
That case proved to me. And Cleve, so you were one of our 6,000 armed response officers, yeah?
I was, yes, yeah.
And when did you leave the police service?
In 2014, but I was an ARV officer, and then I morphed into I was a firearms commander. So, I kind of understand completely, the level of training, the level of assurance that goes through in deploying armed officers to incidents. And so those decisions are not taken lightly. And at the point that's very well made by a previous caller, almost the whole of Europe and the police service of Northern Ireland, all of their officers carry some form of sidearm or at least other weapons.
So why is it, Cleve, and you've worked in the police, why is it that senior police officers, when they're asked this question, always say, no, it's not necessary, it's how we do things? Why do they always shy away from this?
Well, it's the traditional view of the British police officer that we were very proud that for many years we weren't armed. And actually, in my time in the police, when I first joined, I wasn't even carrying, it was optional for me to carry a baton. I didn't have the quick tough. I didn't have the CS gas. I didn't have a paramilitary view or look at me. It was the traditional blue shirt, dark trousers. If you look at our officers now, they do have a more of a paramilitary look because of the way in which things have developed and the recognition.
The world has changed, Cleve, hasn't it?
Absolutely, But people come to expect it now. People see armed officers at airports, and it's part of the way that we are. And it's kind of. So
time to move on, Cleve. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And for me, senior police officers will have their view. I get that, but the very moment an officer gets injured, we have this outcry to arm officers. But it never actually morphs. And
well, let's hope, Cleve, and thank you for your call. Let's hope Simon Chesterman, who is National Lead for Armed Policing, has at least got this debate now really moving. Great call. Thank you. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15. A senior police officer writes a report suggesting that we now start to more routinely arm police officers in this country. He talks particularly about rural areas where response times from the armed response units can be very much higher. And he, of course, references the fact that 12 terror attacks have been stopped over the course of the last year. I have believed now for some time that more people here, more of our police need to carry guns, as we do in Northern Ireland, across the rest of Europe, and of course in the USA. Some of you may think, no, actually, the police carry guns, then the criminals start more routinely to carry guns. We don't want to become like America. But I stick firmly to my view. Piece of news today, the government have now said for certain they will introduce legislation to make the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals £2. Now, you will have noticed that your high streets are now full of either charity shops, coffee shops, or, yes, betting shops. It's kind of like that across the whole country. And I do know that these machines, where people can lose up to 100 quid every 20 seconds, and I do know they're called the crack cocaine of gambling. I know there are people out there with real gambling problems who've ruined their lives on these machines. So I understand the government's response to the cry that something must be done to reduce the stake to £2 a spin. But I tell you what, it will mean a lot of high street betting shops closing. It'll mean a lot of people losing their jobs. And because of the betting levy, some of which goes to the British horse racing industry, there'll be a very big knock-on effect down the line. So it's a classic case to me that you introduce legislation that you believe to be well-intentioned, but actually you will cause harm to other people. And if you're addicted to gambling like this on machines, what's to stop you doing it online anyway? That's my view. Back to whether we should arm the police. James is a first-time caller from Wembley. Good evening, James.
Good evening.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. James, hi.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, have I got this right or have I got this wrong?
Yep. I think you've got it wrong. To be honest.
Okay.
Reason being, I think that it will increase the violence and it will make people a bit more nervous to engage with the police. Also, we already have an armed forces, and I feel like they do enough. If anything goes down, they're there within 3 minutes. So I don't understand why normal police would need guns.
Well, James, when the London Bridge horror happened, the armed response unit was there and dealt with it. And I think I'm right in saying from the first beginning of that atrocity to the conclusion was about 7.5 minutes, something like that, which is incredibly quick, but it's still 7.5 minutes, James, isn't it? And my argument, James, is had the policeman on London Bridge had a gun, he would have saved lives.
Yes, but we have to also remember we're trying to bring the violence down. We're not trying to increase it. So, meaning a situation like on the bridge, I feel like it could be handled in different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean he has to be killed, even though other people are at threat. The police are trained in a certain way, and they have specialities to be able to deal with such situations.
James,
and I don't feel like they need a gun.
James, what could one guy against three, and I think they were pretty drugged up at the time too, which is often the case with these terrorist attacks. It really is a very common feature. What could one guy with an extended truncheon do against three drugged up terrorists intent on murder?
Well, it would be really difficult, but they're trained.
Yeah.
They should know what to do. Plus, you said that there was armed police there already, so...
No, James, let's just get this story right, okay? So the van goes over London Bridge with these three guys on it. They injure and kill some people. They stop the van, they get out, they cross the road, they go down the stairs into Borough Market and continue their murder spree. What I'm saying, James, is that it took 7.5 minutes for the police to get down into Borough Market and to shoot them dead. Actually, that could have been stopped a lot quicker, I think, if that policeman had been armed.
But, I think that the issue is that the armed response team need to find a way to be able to respond quicker to incidents in England instead of you saying that other officers need guns. I don't think that's the case. I think it's the armed police's fault. They shouldn't have took so long. James,
my argument is the armed response teams would respond quicker if there were more of them than 6,000 across the entire country.
I don't agree, man. I just think it's going to be more violence. It's just going to become like America, bloodshed. I also feel like police is going to take advantage of their position. People that don't need to be killed will be killed. People that don't need to be shot will be shot. Because really and truly, you see that. But how often does that stuff like that happen in England? It's very rare. It's very rare that people come out and can go on a killing spree.
Well, it did happen, didn't it? It did happen at that tube station back just after the 2007 tube bombings. If you remember, the guy was shot and killed. And whilst he was an illegal immigrant, he had done, actually in terrorist terms, nothing wrong. James, there is a risk that if we arm... There is a risk that if we arm police officers...
It can be handled better. I feel like it can be handled better.
All right.
I don't feel like normal police should carry guns at all. I feel like it's just going to be the end of us, to be honest.
OK. James, you made your point very clearly. Thank you. And James feeling strongly that it will lead to an increase in violence and the wrong people will get shot. And perhaps in some cases, that may be true. There's no perfect answer. George is a first-time caller from Ashford. Good evening, George.
Hi, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So I'm arguing we need to arm a lot more police officers. The world has changed.
Yeah, do you know what? To be honest with you, I agree with your last caller, James. Mainly because you said at the top of the hour that arming more police, somehow that would help more police get to these sort of scenes a lot quicker. Do you not think, prior to arming more police, they should consider maybe where the locations of a lot of these police officers are? Maybe try that out first, and then maybe look at possibly arming the police. Because I think that should be a last resort. Why would you use violence against violence as the first sort of resolution to something like this?
Because if you... Oh, George, come on, man.
Why would you not think of the locations first?
Well, George, I personally think that if three people have driven over London Bridge, mowing people down, knocking one guy over into the river, I think if they've done that, I think the time to ask questions has finished. You know, the time to...
I think you kind of answered your own question, really. All right, so there's 6,000 armed police, as you said.
Yep.
Why weren't there any walking the beat on London Bridge on a Friday night? Surely that should have already been the case.
Well, I think the answer, George, is that...
Where were those 6,000 police actually at that moment of time?
Well, it could be, and this could well back up your argument. It could be they were all doing bureaucracy and filling in paperwork, and that may be an argument, and I don't know whether that's the case or not. No, you may have a point there. But
Because I think the unarmed police do a great job at this moment of time, yeah? But there are some police officers out there who I've seen in recent documentaries have openly said that they are racist, and that's part of why they do join the police force. Some, which is a minimal amount. So why potentially give people who have agreed to being racist guns?
Well, not about the police being racist, George. At the moment, they've stopped doing stop and search in areas of high knife crime for fear of being thought racist.
No, but all right, I'll tell you the exact documentary I'm talking about. It was a Stephen Lawrence documentary when the reporter went undercover and he was in the academy, and the person in his room with him openly said to him, yeah, he's joined because he wants to, be able to stop black people. He used more extreme words than that. Why would you give someone like that a gun, Nigel?
Well, George, at the moment, we have a spree of murders in London, and most of it, as you well know, is black-on-black crime. That is the absolute truth of what is going on here. And my argument has been...
So how does that strengthen the case of what that police officer was saying?
Well, look, I can't speak for one police officer in a so-called undercover documentary. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is, George, this, that we face a different level of threat, potentially, to anything we've seen in our lifetimes. Look at what happened in Paris, for example, just a few short years ago. And I feel we have to protect ourselves in any way we can against that. And I think we have to just get with the times. Frankly, this is one area where we need to become like other countries, including, of course, part of our own country, Northern Ireland. George, we've got to move with the times and arm more police officers.
Nigel, what a lot of countries do is situate these police officers in the areas where there's high risk. I honestly walk around London and I rarely, apart from when something is going down, see these armed police officers.
George,
I would see one.
George, some people would say you don't see a police officer at all.
Well, there you go. So surely the issue is there's not enough police and not enough armed police.
Well, OK, George, there you and I agree. There need to be more armed police, and for the Met as a whole, broader debate, to only have 4% of their officers on the beat at any one time is a problem. George, I thank you for your call. And George and I, they're not really disagreeing that fundamentally. Folks, I think we've come to the point we have to have a lot more police in big cities and in rural areas that are trained properly and that carry handguns so that they're safer. And if they're safer, do you know what? We're going to be safer too. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:30, and I think it's time we need to arm more police officers, and so does Simon Chesterman, the national lead for armed policing in this country. Before I get back to that debate, I was in Windsor this morning. I was there with Fox News, appearing on Fox and Friends, where interest in America in the royal wedding, I think, is even bigger than it is in this country. Remarkable scenes down at Windsor. I mean, given that it's 48 hours before the royal wedding, we had military bands and marching and practices, really remarkably big crowds on the street. A lot of joy, a lot of happiness, a lot of bunting, Union Jacks, American Stars and Stripes, pictures of Harry and Meghan, all very jolly, but there is a slight taint over things, and we debated that last night on this show, and today we've had the statement that Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, will not be coming to Windsor on Saturday and giving away his daughter. Well, I hope the Mail on Sunday are pleased with themselves. They ran that front page on Sunday, which they'd picked up from a celebrity gossip news site, TMZ, in America. And I have to say, my sense last night on this show, and my sense on the streets of Windsor today, is there is great sympathy for Thomas Markle. Meghan Markle herself has put out a statement saying, "Sadly, my father will not be attending our wedding. I've always cared for my father and hope that he can be given space he needs to focus on his health." I've always cared for my father. I would have thought she could have used a stronger word than that. I was a little bit surprised, to say the least, by that statement. But it's going to be a great day nonetheless. At least I hope it is. My worry, of course, is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, who I am not a particularly great supporter of. He's going to perform the ceremony. Earlier on, he told LBC how he was feeling about it.
I've always been nervous before weddings because they matter so much to the people involved, and you want it to be very special for them. But this one, the presence of sort of however many 100 million people on television does slightly alter the context.
Oh, can't we just get rid of him? Isn't he frightful? Isn't he awful? He is the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's the leader of our established church. They go, I feel a bit nervous about doing that. Well, resign then. Let's get somebody else who's better. It's pathetic. No wonder church attendances at the C of E are as poor as they are. Right, back to arming the police. I think we need to. I get an SMS. Armed police would stop violent crime, not cause it. That mentality is protecting the violent criminals. Nigel, what would have happened if the terrorist, this is talking about London Bridge, if the terrorist had overpowered the police officer and taken his gun? How many more lives would have been lost firing into that bar? Asked Chris from Leeds. Well, Chris, if they'd wanted guns, they could have got them. The fact they've been banned in this country does not mean you can't get hold of them, because you can. And it isn't just knife crime that's escalating in London and elsewhere, it's gun crime too. Nigel, if we had proper deterrent sentences in this country, the police would not need to be routinely armed, says Ted. Look, that may work, but it doesn't work, does it, for terrorists? It doesn't work for Islamic extremists who are not in the least bit concerned about dying in the process of committing their atrocities. Not relevant for them. Nigel, I'm quite happy for our tax money to be spent on at least one permanent firearms officer in each village to protect us. I was previously against arming the police, but not anymore, says Graham in Bristol. Well, Graham, I have to say, up until a few years ago, I was with the view that we don't need to do it. I was with the view that if the local police in rural England were known to be armed, that burglars would themselves decide to up the ante and carry guns as well. But I think the new threat, the new level of threat that we face, mean we have to face up to this. And, particularly as we hear that 12, and I've no reason for 1 minute here to disbelieve the authorities, that 12 terrorist attacks have been thwarted over the course of the last year. Let's ask James in Harlow how he feels about this. Good evening.
Yeah, I think it's a really bad idea for three reasons. One is, do you know how much one of them guns that the police would carry would go for on the street, so it'd make police a target? It's about £5,000 they could sell it for.
Well, hang on, James. You can buy a decent handgun for 500 quid.
Yeah, but police ones carry semi-automatics. They're harder to get. But anyway, also, the second reason is, Northern Ireland has different gun laws to us, as does the rest of Europe. They're not as strict. The third one is, there'd be more afraid to approach the police, which won't help anything when we've got bad relations with them. It is. Don't get me wrong, I'm pretty conservative on things, but this one I don't think would work.
All right, well, James, I mean, look, as far as black market guns is concerned, they're out there anyway. So I'm going to kind of discount that. But what I'm really interested in is this idea. I mean, so you genuinely think that the police would be less approachable to us if we knew they were armed?
Yep. What we should do instead is three things. One, change the laws on self-defence spray so people can carry them, so there'd be less violent crime. Secondly, have one designated armed officer per town, like no one permanently on duty, who's just one firearm officer in every town. And third, have a tax specifically for policing, prisons, and crime prevention.
So, James, actually, you're not disagreeing with me completely, are you? I mean, I'm arguing that 6,500, and how they're deployed, of course, is a debate, and we had that before the news. But what I'm saying, James, is we need more police officers to be armed. And you yourself are saying there should be somebody on duty in every town.
Yeah, but not every single officer, just one.
All right. So
then it's pretty dangerous balance, because we have different gun laws to Europe. Very different ones.
Yeah, we do. But I mean, having the police carrying arms in Northern Ireland hasn't necessarily directly caused a problem of any kind, does it?
Yeah, but the difference is there's the issue that the public in Northern Ireland can carry guns. We can't over here, so
Some of them can. Yeah, some of them can.
You can
That's
carry
true.
them for self-defence, which you can't here, so that's a very different law. So I think there's a bit of an ethical dilemma in that regard as well.
Okay,
You know
James.
what I mean?
No, you've thought it through very, very clearly. Thank you. And again, James, not really being 1,000 miles away from me. I think we need more armed officers, and James kind of almost thinks that as well. Completely agree, Nigel. It's just the logical thing to do. The best way to reduce the time in between a terrorist infiltration is to increase the number of armed officers. Well, London Bridge did prove that to me. The police are already trigger happy, I get, using tasers on a blind man holding a white stick. What on earth would they be like with a loaded gun in their hand? I dread to think, says Jan in Norwich. Chris is a first-time caller from Chichester. Good evening, Chris.
How you doing, Nigel? Big fan.
Well, very good to have you on. So, Chris, you know, I'm getting a lot of people telling me now that if the police have guns, they'll be using them indiscriminately. I don't believe that.
I think you're right, but I wouldn't trust the police with guns today. I have to say, I did the job for 32 years.
Wow.
And I was 5 years as a firearms officer. I just wouldn't trust today's police officers with firearms. I just don't think they're up.
Chris, that is an
anymore.
astonishing statement for somebody who served 32 years in the police force.
Seriously, I wouldn't trust the police these days with a wooden stick. Oh, it's not wooden anymore, they use batons. But seriously, I just don't think the majority of police officers these days are up to the job. I just don't. I think it's shocking. They're poorly led and managed. The recruitment has been absolutely hijacked by political correctness. And the days of the tough cop that could look after himself and defend himself and is ruthless. And you have to be ruthless as a firearms officer. They're gone. They're just not up to that anymore.
Chris, when did you join the police force?
I joined the police force in 1974.
And were you, for your 32 years, proud to be a police officer?
Absolutely. I served, and I was very proud to serve, and I loved the job. It was a blast. I loved it.
So are you telling me, are you seriously, Chris, are you seriously telling me that since you left the police force in 2006, just over a decade ago, that it's completely, fundamentally declined as a decent operational force?
No, not since I left the organisation. It was going that way already. And you have to understand that political correctness has completely hijacked the recruiting system. And it's all down to minorities, females, how can we do this, how can we do that? And most of these people these days are poorly led and managed, and really, they're just not up to the job. And I would, and bear in mind, Nigel, in the US, it's something like 50% of officers who are shot dead are killed with their own firearms. That's a fact. And you know, I just don't think they're up to it these days.
So, Chris, how do we deal with the fact that we have in Britain and Europe, you know, a genuine, real terrorist threat? It exists. How do we deal with it?
Well, at London Bridge, they were extremely fortunate. They had an ARV out, and they were on the scene pretty quickly. I think that's the only problem is clearly the country and rural, and I live in a very rural area.
Yeah.
You know, that's a problem. That's a problem, and I don't know how we're going to deal with that, because it's, you know, the thing is, if people are going to commit terrorist atrocities, Nigel, they're not going to do it in Wiltshire. They're going to do it where it attracts the most.
Well, generally that's true. Although, you know, there have been in France, in Grenoble and small little towns. So you know, we have seen in France terrorism, albeit not large scale. But hey, if one person's killed by terrorism, that's bad. We have seen it happening in France in smaller towns and cities. So it's not impossible, is it?
It's not. I mean, the case where the priest had his throat cut, I think that was a fairly real. That was absolutely appalling. But you see, you've got a culture in Europe where the police have always been armed.
Yes.
You know, if you go to nearly all the police forces in Europe, they're armed.
And Northern Ireland are too, Chris.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's a bit of a different. You know why that's different. But the concept now of training, and they actually bear in mind the logistics of training and refreshing all the police officers if you were going to go about routine arming, is virtually impossible. And I don't think we could actually do it. They cut the number down now just to actually get the training and refreshing through.
Well,
you know, but,
Chris, all I can say to you, after somebody who served 5 years as a firearms officer and 32 years in the police, is if you really think our police are now that low grade, you wouldn't trust them with a gun. It's the most depressing phone call I've had this evening. But I thank you, Chris, our first-time caller from Chichester. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:45. Should more of our police officers be armed? A senior police officer, indeed Simon Chesterman, who's the national lead for armed policing, thinks we should. I now, for some time, have thought we've simply got to deal with the threats of the modern world. But before I get there, President Trump has been talking about California state law with Sheriff Margaret Mims, and in particular sanctuary cities, areas that do provide actually havens for people who are illegally in America. The conversation got round to MS-13. This is the gang that's been described by the FBI as the most violent gang in the USA. And you know, they started out in Los Angeles, and they're really bad people. Trump was talking about this, but it's led to quite a reaction.
Thank you. There can be an MS-13 gang member I know about. If they don't reach a certain threshold, I cannot tell ICE about them.
We have people coming into the country or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them. But we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before. And because of the weak laws, they come in fast. We get them, we release them, we get them again, we bring them out. It's crazy. The dumbest laws, as I said before, the dumbest laws on immigration in the world.
So be in no doubt, folks, MS-13 is real. They are violent. They are horrendous. They do very, very nasty things to people. And Trump there is saying that some of their number are made up by illegal immigrants. These people are animals, and he's pleased they're starting to get rid of them. That has led to loveydom in Los Angeles and on the West Coast going absolutely berserk. And famously, the comedian Kathy Griffin, who said a lot of things about the president before, she says, the president of the USA is calling immigrants animals. He's acting just like it's just the criminals, but he really means all immigrants. And celeb after celeb are saying that he's dehumanising, are saying that he's acting like a Nazi, and of course, the CNNs and many of the cable news channels, you know, are running this. Trump calls immigrants and illegal immigrants animals. And that, folks, is what you call fake news. It is a deliberate distortion of something the president has said, and the same thing would happen in this country. If a senior cabinet minister, you know, was to talk about bad, violent people who happen to be illegal immigrants, he or she would get the same treatment, which I guess is why virtually nobody in the British cabinet dares to stand up in the wake of Windrush and say a Dickie Bird. Back to arming the police. I've got Pavel on, who's a first-time caller from Southampton. Good evening, Pavel.
Hello, Nigel. Hello.
Hello. So,
let me start from first thing, which I want to tell you straight away.
Yes.
I don't like you because what you have done with the Brexit, but that's the separate subject.
It is. Okay. Well, ring again, Pavel. When we're discussing Brexit, we're very, very happy to hear from you. But what about this subject?
I think you should have the police force armed.
You do?
Every single of them. Every single of them. Let me tell you the background which I come from. I am the former criminal. Actually, you cannot be former. You are either criminal or not. I spent 4 years in prison. And trust me, these people do not understand anything else than a force.
Yeah.
You should have the police force armed. You should have it.
Pavel, can I ask?
This subject,
Can I ask you? Can I ask you what particular crime you were in prison for?
Vice. I've been sentenced to imprisonment for armed robbery. That was the first time.
Armed robbery.
And the second, armed robbery. And the second time, I was sentenced for participation in organized crime group.
So, Pavel, if you had been engaged in armed robbery and if the policeman had been armed, you would now be dead.
Well, life is tough.
Well, life is tough. Pavel, when you started off by saying that you're a former criminal, and then you said, no, I'm not. I mean, Are you actually a former criminal? Are you reformed, or do you wish to go back to that way of life?
Well, let me tell you this. I think I have understand my mistakes.
Uh-huh.
Whatever I have done before is one thing. Whatever I'm doing now, which is completely different to my past,
Good.
is a different thing.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that. But you think, and you've lived for 4 years with, in a prison with a criminal community, all they understand is people being tough. So you think we should arm every single police officer?
Yes, every single of them. There is one thing I would like to say.
Yep.
They all should be really, really well trained.
Yes, of course.
And in that case, I would say I would completely support you all the way. I don't support you on the Brexit, but I support you on the...
Pavel, it's a great phone call, and I'm going to be talking about this phone call after the show. Thank you for calling up, and thank you for being so frank and so honest. Gosh, that was Pavel in Southampton. I'm not quite sure what to say now or where to go, really. Jeanette says, after listening to Chris earlier on, I've changed my mind. Only selective, competent officers should be armed. And Chris was the 32-year police officer who spent 5 years in the Armed Response Unit, who was worried about the calibre, frankly, of today's police. And Mark, and I was expecting to hear this a little bit, I don't want to see police with firearms. I don't want this country to become like the States. And that is a feeling, Mark, that some people really do have. Let's go to Jonathan in Finchley. Good evening, Jonathan.
Hi, Nigel. My view is that the police should have non-lethal weapons so that they don't get into trouble by shooting the wrong people or actually attracting fire upon themselves. If you go on Wikipedia and type in non-lethal weapons, there's loads of them.
Yes.
I just discovered the active denial system weapons is a dish that projects electromagnetic radiation powerful enough to penetrate human skin and make the nervous system think the victim is on fire. There's loads and loads of them. And I think, in fact, in America, maybe people can defend themselves with non-lethal weapons as well instead of having guns, and that could be part of the constitutional amendment.
Yeah, but we have tasers now, Jonathan, don't we? We have tasers, etc. now.
So what's wrong with tasers, if they work? Why do we need guns?
Well, I think it's about range, isn't it? So a taser is only going to be effective at a certain range, whereas a handgun would be effective at, I'm guessing... Well, they're not easy to fire, of course, but certainly 200 or 300 yards a firearm could be pretty effective at. So range is an issue. I mean, Jonathan, I just keep going back to that brave young police officer. Some will say he was just doing his job. I think he was brave on London Bridge, going up to 3 drugged-up terrorists carrying knives and machetes, and all he had was an extendable baton. Now, he needed... I mean, I think you and I would agree he needed more, didn't he?
Well, Nigel, that's what's called anecdotal. Yes, you're taking one anecdote. It was a terrible, terrible thing that happened. You need to look at the bigger picture. You need to look at the picture here in the United States and other countries and see whether arming of police overall, over the whole year, over several years, makes us safer or not. You can take any single example, and you can't derive a whole case for the whole of the police.
No, of course not. But I was using it. I was using it, Jonathan, merely as an illustration. The guy got stabbed in the eye, stabbed elsewhere. He's lucky to be alive. Okay, but no, Jonathan, your point that there are pretty effective non-lethal weapons is a strong one and a powerful one. I get an SMS. The retired officer from Chichester is right. Today's officer is badly trained, has attitude, is led by people who've never arrested a criminal and don't even know the law, says Mick. Mick, that is pretty scathing about our police force. When I'm travelling in Europe and I see armed officers, I feel safer. Well, yeah, OK, Harry, in Bedford. That's my contention. I've got time for one last quick caller, which is Hazel from Sandhurst. Good evening.
Hi, Nigel. Yeah, I think it's time for the police to get tough. For so long now, they've been much too PC. We've got too soft, and it's just got silly. I don't feel safe anymore. I haven't been to my hometown in Reading for 5 years because I don't feel safe. I travel to work 2 times a week across country, so I live in a semi-rural area.
Yep.
I go through 4 villages to get to where I need to work, and I've never, ever, in that 2 years, seen a police car until today. And I actually, when I got home, I said to my partner, guess what I saw today?
Yeah, I heard the first cuckoo of the year, or saw a swallow arrive, or no, I saw a policeman. Well, Hazel, I think one thing a lot of us agree on is whether they're armed or not, we'd like to see more police on the streets. The figure that I've got for just 4% of the Met being on the street at any one time is worrying. Hazel, thank you. Hazel would feel safer if her local police officers were there and carried a gun. Do you know what? I would too. Hey, you've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here at LBC. I'll be back on Sunday morning at 10. At 10 o'clock tonight, it's going to be Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.